Okay. Hey, everybody. My name is Rachel Holiday, and we also have,
Hi, my name's Jasmin Vera.
and we're presenting on reducing barriers to employment for individuals with criminal histories. So we chose this subject because of our little literary learning circle group. We read the book, The Face of Social Suffering, The Life History of a Street Drug Addict by Meryl Singer. So the character in the story, Tony, he is coming in and out of prison often, but near the end of the book, he finds himself wanting to seek employment, wanting to change and have a life in sobriety away from drug use. So when we talked about this issue, we talked about how difficult it is for people um, with criminal histories, those with like serious offenses like felony convictions, how there's just ultimately a lack of employment opportunity. And so that's our social policy issue. Um, and so when I was looking into figuring out how to introduce this topic, I wanted to do a little bit of information on reentry planning and programs. So I found um, this detail here in the Urban Institute Justice Policy Center, which states that every corrections agency has a system in place to guide how a person is released from prison. Some systems are nothing more than a checklist, while others involve extensive documentation of prisoner histories and significant outreach to service providers in the community. Um, I couldn't find any information on whether or not correction agencies um, or facilities, which is like a jail, prison, or any other detention facility used to house people who have been arrested, detained, held, or convicted by any agents, criminal justice agency. I couldn't find anything where they stated they have to have reentry planning or a program. So I assume to some extent they do. And according to the Utah Department of Corrections, preparing offenders for release begins on the day they enter the system. So I thought it was really interesting to note. And they do this in various evaluations and programs available to inmates, such as case management, substance treatment, sex offense treatment, education, and reentry planning, which includes finding employment. Um, and so when they are released from prison or jail, I found some information on post-conviction supervision in Utah. So individuals under supervision, probation, or supervised release are assigned to a probation officer who is responsible for monitoring them and ensuring they comply with conditions ordered by the court. And that includes employment. Oh, excuse me. So in this slide, I wanted to talk about some of the benefits and barriers of having employment after incarceration. So some benefits are it helps people gain economic stability after release, reduces the likelihood that they return to prison, also promoting greater public safety. And then the same reasons as everybody else wants to get a job, right? To pursue life goals and to strengthen their communities. And sometimes I feel like we forget about that aspect for them, that they do have goals, they do have wants and needs in their life, and so their reason to find a job is the same as anybody else. Barriers to finding an employment include limited education, limited work experience, substance use and other physical mental health problems, lack of skills, employer discrimination, which a lot of our policies that we're going to discuss relate to, and then ultimately a extensive criminal record. So in this slide, I wanted to talk about some research that I found through the US Department of Justice. They did a study back in 2010, but they're, analyzing and reporting on the results, which was in 2021, and they found that 33% of persons that released from federal prison in 2010 did not find employment at any time during the 4 years after they were released from prison, and this was a cohort of about 51,000 people, and that I think they had a total of 75,000 people that were released, but they were able to, um, have a cohort of 51,000 people. And at any given time during 4 years, no more than 40% were employed. So that was about 67% of the time of release. And then in another study or report was through the Prison Policy Initiative in 2022. And they took these same studies and they generalized the findings to state that 60% of formerly incarcerated people are jobless in the US. So they use the term jobless and rather than unemployment. They unemployment rate is different from a joblessness rate because unemployment refers to people who are actively looking for work. So they couldn't generalize to say that that was a true unemployment rate. Um, and they compared this to the US unemployment rate in 2010, and then which was when they were released, which was 9.6%, and then in 2020, which was an unemployment rate at 15%. So you can see in this chart here, the joblessness rate compared to the unemployment rate is pretty significant for those who were recently released from prison. And also from the chart, you can see as time went on, with from 6 months to 4 years, the struggle to find a job grew as that time went on. And this is just another chart from the Prison Policy Initiative, and this was a report in 2018. And so from this report, it stated that they came up with the first and only national unemployment rate for formerly incarcerated people, which showed that people they were employed at a rate of over 27%, which was higher than any historical period in the United States, including the Great Depression. So I think that's pretty interesting. I thought it was something um, significant to share with you all, just how um, this group of people experiences unemployment. And in this next slide, I just wanted to discuss some disparities and then our reasons why incarcerated individuals should have access to employment opportunities. So some existing barriers include race and gender. For example, formerly incarcerated Black women experience severe levels of unemployment, which was at 43.6%, whereas white men experienced the lowest at 18.4%. Also, wages. Formerly incarcerated people earn less than the general population, and this was according to median weekly earnings in the first year of release from that 2010 study. And formerly incarcerated people earn about $269, and then general population's about 500. And then also quality of jobs. It's often difficult to keep good quality jobs or jobs in general because they're either temporary jobs, they're dangerous jobs, or jobs that just don't protect individuals from wrongful termination, so they could be let go at any time. And from the study as well, they found that some of the major industries that are employing formerly incarcerated people are waste management, which was number one, construction, and food service. And so, why do we think that these individuals should have employment? Because there are so many people who are coming in and out of prison each year. Um, there's about 80 million Americans with a criminal record. There are more than 600,000 individuals that are released from state and federal prisons each year. More than 2/3 of prisoners are rearrested within 3 years of their release, and half are reincarcerated. So failed reentry leads to more victims, more crime, and then also more pressure on state and federal systems, including budgets, which contributes to community instability, and then mass incarceration. And that equals a failed system. So we need to find a way to help individuals who were formerly incarcerated seek employment. So I'm going to talk about some of the current policies and laws related to the issue. The only national one that I really want to discuss briefly is the Fair Chance to Compete for Jobs Act of 2019. And this was passed on December 17th in Congress, and it was part of the National Defense Authorization Act, and it's also known as ban the box legislation. And one key provision is that federal agencies and federal civilian and defense contractors may not request information on an arrest and conviction history until a conditional job offer has been extended to the applicant. And Jasmin will talk about Section 3452201, which is a law in Utah, and she'll talk about that later in the presentation. And some other legislation regarding or affecting formerly incarcerated people in Utah includes Senate Bill 95, which is limitations on employer liability. So it protects employers from being sued for hiring, negligent hiring of an employee based solely on evidence that an employee has been previously convicted in Utah or in another jurisdiction for an offense. So there has to be a cause for that, but also it only applies to the following industries, which include automotive, construction, culinary arts, manufacturing, oil, gas, or mining, and transportation. And House Bill 468 is employment screening requirements, and this bill addresses employment background screening for mental health professionals. So it prohibits certain public employers and public contractors from considering certain arrests or criminal convictions or denying employment based on certain criminal convictions or participation in substance use treatment. So this is related to when they're wanting to hire a mental health professional who may have a criminal history. And so there's a long list of recommendations, guidelines in this bill. So those are the two that I wanted to introduce, and I'll go ahead and let Jasmin take over.
Hi. So our position in this issue is that individuals with criminal records should have access to employment opportunities. It should not be as difficult as it has been shown to be for a person who has been released from prison to find employment. It may only become a bit easier after the record has been expunged to find employment, but getting your record expunged takes time, and there is a process that includes having the funds to pay for it. It is difficult for a person with a criminal background to be called in for an interview, to be offered employment, or to be kept, or to be able to keep that employment. We have been seeing a rise in incarceration rates that can be due to the war on drugs and to the changes in criminal justice policy. These developments have been and continue to be made by the government, thus contributing to the mass incarceration rates. As we have learned, what happens around an individual can have an immediate influence on their behaviors and their choices. Therefore, this population can find suitable and quality employment that will help them by having a role in society, along with having access to opportunities to create a life that they deserve. They deserve a second chance to become a better version of themselves. There are also benefits to having those long-term and stable employments. It could prevent an individual from reoffending, gaining that economic stability, and creating a purpose, a self-purpose. And then the social work literature would encourage and advocate for there to be job opportunities for persons with a criminal background. It promotes that equal access to job opportunities for the vulnerable individuals who have been released from jail or prison and are now integrating themselves back into the community. Social work literature also promotes rehabilitation, which after committing a crime, the population has the potential to be reformed. And then the public view, the public opinion for this position would be of similar views. If the purpose for the prisons is to reinform and rehabilitate then why should society continue to punish them afterwards? A person can have the experience, the skills, and personality for a specific position in a job, but are unable to move forward with hiring due to their criminal backgrounds. It can be devastating for some individuals and some employers. It's about giving them a second chance and the opportunity to find employment that can be beneficial for the individual, the employer, and the community. UCI is the Utah Correctional Industries, and they actually have a program that's available inside of the Utah State Prison. This helps with the reentry employment opportunities. A course is taught and skills are learned to prepare them for the work field upon release. Some of the subjects that they discuss are recognizing high risk situations, knowing their triggers, stopping and thinking, actions and consequences, working together, and problem solving. And I think that UCI is a great program. They also have a bunch of other programs within UCI that has clothing, embroidery, they make furniture, they also work on the whole processing of orders. So I think it's a really great program that shows that the public view is with providing employment opportunities for the incarcerated. So then the nature and the current state of social policy, Utah acknowledges that there are negative attitudes towards hiring individuals with criminal backgrounds and are attempting to help with the many obstacles that they may encounter. So Utah Code 34-52-201 states that a public employer may not exclude an individual from an initial hearing because of their past records. They also cannot ask them about their expense records, yet the individual can be excluded if it is required to disclose the criminal background, and an individual can be asked about their background during that initial interview. Also, the employer can consider the information when deciding if they want to hire them. With that being said, when an individual with a criminal background applies for a job, they still have to struggle with the possibility of being excluded or having their past be used against them and not be offered the position. This is a vulnerable population that the number of rejections, the amount of stress, and the disappointment can be risk factors towards their rehabilitation and treatment. And in the 2023 legislation session, HB 181 is the Offender Employment Amendments, which was passed. What this legislation will do is have the Department of Workforce Services create and maintain a web portal that provides job opportunities for individuals with criminal histories. This will become effective on May 3rd, 2023. And jobs can be posted and updated on that web portal, and anyone can read more about the job that's available, and then they can make the decision if it works for them as well. Another great thing about this is that it requires the Department of Corrections to give access to the individuals and set them up with accounts prior to them being released from prison. There are also many tax credits for employers who do hire individuals with criminal backgrounds and who are being released from prison. And so those are some of the current state policies that we have. And then some potential unintended consequences for this is it could be that the person who has a criminal background and who have been employed may not be able to adapt to that working life once upon release. And then that the employer could potentially create a stressful environment for the individual where that person may not know how to process or cope with the stress effectively. And then, so some of the counter positions that I was able to find on this issue, one of them is that the persons with criminal background should not be allowed to have access to sensitive job positions depending on their criminal record. If an individual who is seeking employment had a violent past, then they should not be allowed to be around other vulnerable communities. Another view is that this population will reoffend. For example, if an individual had theft charges, then that person can easily steal from their employment. Employers worry that relapsing can occur, causing the individual to miss work or not show up for their shifts. And another opposing view that I saw would be that hiring an individual with criminal background can be a huge liability for the company. Basing the assumptions of the person's past, employers worry that the individual could cause harm to the company. And then some social work literature that I found on this is that social work literature says that individuals who are reentering from community are at risk of recidivism because of their inability to adjust within their communities. It is a possibility for a person to reoffend. It also says that it can become difficult to adjust in the outside world because there are so many barriers that an ex-offender must face. For example, access to housing, transportation, healthcare, food assistance, and the lack of employment opportunities. The counter public view would be just upon research and reading articles. I read many of the comments, and the public were stating their concerns for individuals with criminal records to be employed in certain areas. Many of their views fall along the lines of working with the vulnerable populations like children and the elderly, and with sensitive information. They fear that an ex-offender could offend again and that society is willing to put them in scenarios where they can easily do so. I believe that many of the comments are made by individuals who are desperately trying to prove a point by making comments about previous offenders working in positions that they could easily reoffend. For example, like hiring a former addict as a pharmacist. That was a reason I kept coming across an example of it. There are also no sound arguments or oops. There are no sound arguments. Sorry, 1 second. Something happened to my computer. Okay, so there are no sound arguments that I was able to find as to the real risks of hiring an individual with a criminal record. And then the next slide talked about the nature and the current state of social policy. So again, bringing up the Utah Code 34-52-201, it states that individuals with criminal backgrounds can be excluded from initial interviews if they are applying within a law enforcement agency, criminal or juvenile justice system, a non-employee volunteer wanting to work with children or vulnerable adults, within the Department of Alcoholic Beverage Services, the State Tax Commission, and employers whose primary function is finances, and a public transit district that is hiring or promoting for safety sensitive positions. So basically, there is already a policy in place that can exclude individuals with criminal backgrounds from these interviews if they are applying in these certain areas, showing that the counter or the opposing arguments isn't as sound, because if they did a little bit more research, they'll be able to find that there's already some places that they would be excluded from. And then the next subject is the pragmatic implications. So some of the pragmatic implications would be that the rates of unemployment will rise dramatically. There would be higher likelihoods for recidivism, higher rates of homelessness, and the unfair treatment of group of individuals. And again, these pragmatic implications are in case if the opposing views were to win with the debate, these would be some of those implications that would occur because of it. And then, so approximately 60% of the unemployment rates are seen within the formerly incarcerated population. These rates will only continue to increase if there continues to be limited job opportunities. Approximately 50% of the populations have been reincarcerated and are more likely to be arrested 3 years after being released. And then the limited resources available and lack of employment opportunity contribute to the likelihood of reoffending. So access to stable housing is extremely difficult for formerly incarcerated individuals. With no income, and an individual is unable to pay for housing, causing them to become homeless. Along those lines, if an individual is constantly worried about where they're going to sleep, and then it can become another obstacle within their employment. And yeah, so that's what I have for the our positions and then the opposing positions for employment for the individuals with criminal backgrounds.
Awesome.
And then
So we have one future, I guess, solution refinement that could be brought to legislation or possibly expanded through legislation. And I also have two that are not listed here, but Jasmin kind of talked about them earlier. But first, the expand fair chance slash ban the box law to private employers. So as Jasmin was stating, the ban the box law in Utah is currently only applicable to public employers. So if we were to expand that to private employers, would be able to expand the job environment for those who were formerly incarcerated. And in a study, I found that 15 states and 22 cities and counties extended their fair chance laws to private employers, and Utah was not one of them. And two other solutions could be making federal bonding more available to employers and then expanding the work opportunity tax credit. I'm not sure currently what those look like in Utah, but the federal bonding is a placement tool which is sponsored by the US Department of Labor and is basically insurance policy that protects employers from any loss or money or property due to employee dishonesty. And it's free of charge to employers who hire a job applicant who is a risk based on their personal background. And then there's their work opportunity tax credit. And this tax credit is given to employers who hire persons under supervision who were convicted of a felony and who are hired within 1 year of the conviction or released from prison. And so, from my readings of the work opportunity tax credit, I heard it's a very extensive process with lots of paperwork. And one of the recommendations was to make that process easier for employers to go through. So maybe that would help expedite or persuade some employers into using those employer incentives. So that's all we have for you. I don't know if Jasmine has any lasting words. No? All righty.
that
Well,
is
thank
all.
you. Thanks for listening to our presentation. These are our references. Thank you. Figure out how to